So here we are in the final section of chapter 12, the collapse of Reconstruction. So in this section, we're going to be looking at how Reconstruction eventually all came to an end. And that end was really I don't even love using the word end to talking about Reconstruction, because to me the word end implies, when we say it ended, that it did what it was supposed to do. It implies that it reached a conclusion. It implies that they set out to do a certain job, they did the job, and it ended. And that's not really how Reconstruction worked out, as we're going to see. I think it's actually a little bit better to use the word abandoned to talk about Reconstruction. That ultimately is what kind of happens. Is it's not so much of a, hey, we accomplished our goal, so now we're done. It's more of a, well, this isn't working so well, so we might as well just move on to something else. It's really more abandoned than anything else. But we're going to see about how all that works out, and how, as I already hinted at multiple times, there were so many great changes that went into effect during Reconstruction, but how many of those changes end up being short-lived, meaning that they didn't last really long, because once Reconstruction was over with and the federal government was no longer present in those southern states, forcing southern states to obey certain rules, forcing them to do certain things, forcing them to not do certain things, when that's no longer the case, they're going to go back to their old ways. They're going to find ways to keep certain people in power and keep certain people out of power. And we're going to see how all of that happened. So one thing that we haven't yet really talked about with Reconstruction was how, Southerners, a lot of different Southerners reacted to it. Keeping in mind that during Reconstruction, the kind of changes that we saw Republican governments being elected all over the South, Republicans being empowered, Republicans gaining all kinds of control, African Americans voting in huge numbers who largely voted Republican, African Americans being elected to office, African Americans gaining a whole lot more freedom, public schools being improved, other social institutions being improved, taxes going up, public works projects, all those kinds of things. So, and of course, there are a lot of people that liked and benefited from those changes. But we need to talk about how most white Southerners felt about all of that. Most white Southerners, as you can probably guess, hated Reconstruction, resented it with a passion, despised Reconstruction. They hated, to them, Reconstruction just symbolized their defeat. It symbolized that they had lost. It symbolized that their world, everything that they knew before the war, that was over. That this was all symbolic of change. It was, they resented that African Americans were able to vote, that they had racial equality just like them. They resented the North telling them what to do, no matter what that was. So they resented, that presence of the federal government in their lives. They resented the fact that the federal government was telling them what to do and making them do things that they didn't want and they didn't believe in, and they hated the fact that they were shut out of it. Keep in mind that according to the Military Reconstruction Act, these former Confederate leaders, white Southern Democrats, those folks, they can't vote, they can't hold office. They're being told, no, you can't participate, and all these people can. And so they very much hated that. And so they are going to express that anger in a number of ways, and they are also going to particularly target that anger at certain people, at certain groups. One group of people that white Southerners will really target their anger at, group of people that they will kind of single out and label as part of the problem, as in Reconstruction, is a group of people that they will call carpetbaggers. Now, the carpetbaggers, these were Northerners who came south during the war, or after the war, rather, during Reconstruction, for a number of reasons. And they're called carpetbaggers because imagine them with in these days, there were these really inexpensive suitcases that are made out of carpet. The guy in the picture here above me has one, and so they oftentimes had those carpet bags, which is why they get called the carpetbaggers. So just think of Northerners traveling with their carpet bags. They could have been politicians. Some of them were politicians that saw political opportunity in the South, say, hey, well, I can't get elected in Indiana, let me get on to Georgia and see if I can get elected there. Many of them are business people. They are there to seek investment opportunities. They're saying, hey, there's a lot of rebuilding going on in the South. I've got an opportunity here to invest my money or build a factory or get involved in this or whatever. They could have been people working for the Freedmen's Bureau. They could have been people teaching in Freedmen's Bureau schools. But the thing is, they are Northerners. carpetbaggers. And so Southerners, of course, saw them as like invaders. So they were all these Northerners coming down here to pick on us. They're Northerners coming down here trying to tell us what to do. They're Northerners coming down here to, to run our governments for us so that we won't, that we can't, and all this kind of thing. They're meddling in our affairs. So they were seen as intruders. They were seen as outsiders. And the other thing is they get labeled as being really, really corrupt, that they're all criminals, that they're all like swindlers. And the truth is there were a handful that were like that. There were plenty that were there to take advantage of a situation, that got people involved in some underhanded deals, that did something illegal, that swindled people out of money, that were self-interested, and that kind of thing. That did go on. And there were politicians that, for one reason or another, spent too much money, got Southern governments into debt, caused bankruptcy and things like that. It was probably a small minority of them, but it's one of those things where, a handful of people did something wrong and then they all get labeled that way. Truthfully, a lot of carpetbaggers, even those that might have made poor business decisions, a lot of them just really wanted to help, or, saw the South as needing their help, but they get labeled as all being just a bunch of crooks, and a bunch of people that came down trying to, be sleazy and make money and all this kind of stuff. So they really hated them. They hated the fact that they were outsiders, and they hated the fact that they felt they were all crooked and there just to take advantage of Southerners, as this kind of cartoon picture here sort of depicts. They also hate a group of people that get labeled as the scalawags. Now, scalawags, that's probably a word you've heard before in a movie or something. It certainly wasn't made up for Reconstruction, so this word was already around, but it kind of gets rebranded during Reconstruction. Scalawags was what white Southerners called Southerners, their own, that supported Reconstruction. Any Southerner that was supportive of Reconstruction, that was cooperating with Reconstruction, that was voting Republican, that seemed to be supportive, or at the very least seemed to be benefiting from the changes made during Reconstruction, would have been labeled as a scalawag. And by calling them a scalawag, they were trying to say this person's a traitor, they're a turncoat, they've turned their back on the South, they've turned their back on their own people, and they're working with the enemy, they're working with Northerners, and they're benefiting from all these changes they're bringing to us. So carpetbaggers and scalawags are both people that were in some way benefiting from the whole Reconstruction situation, but carpetbaggers are all Northerners, outsiders, whereas scalawags are all Southerners, seen kind of as traitors. So these are two groups of people that would have been targets when white Southerners start trying to fight back against Reconstruction. So for these people in Reconstruction, for white Southern Democrats, they, in their minds, the only way they can stop this, they can stop Reconstruction and take back control is through violence. They, in their minds, because they can't vote and they can't run for office, the only way that they can fight back is with violence, with raw, unadulterated, ugly violence. And so the South could be quite an ugly and a violent and a very bloody place during the Reconstruction years, while white Southerners are launching this campaign of fear and violence and threats and intimidation to undermine Reconstruction, to stop it. And of course that is done through groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So the Ku Klux Klan is formed in southern states, all over southern states, in Reconstruction as a means of undermining and stopping Reconstruction. These vigilante groups that tried to take the situation into their own hands, in their minds, trying to restore the South and restore their honor and all this business. But what they were doing was using violence, using threats, using intimidation, murdering people to try to stop them from voting Republican, to stop them from supporting Reconstruction, to stop them from making any of the changes that were being made during Reconstruction. So they have certainly targeted African Americans, particularly those that were trying to vote, those that were achieving economic success, if they owned their own land, if they had a successful business. Carpetbaggers, scalawags, anybody that was supporting Reconstruction, anybody that was supporting Republicans, voting for the Republicans, that was benefiting from Reconstruction policies or seemed to like them in some kind of a way or were going along with it, they would have been targets for the Ku Klux Klan. And that might have been, you were threatened, that might have been your family was threatened, that might have been people being beaten, but it absolutely means people being killed too. The murder rate is incredibly high. They also targeted not just people, but they targeted African American schools, Freedmen's Bureau offices, Freedmen's Bureau schools, African American businesses, churches, things like that. Anything that was symbolic or anything that would have that kind of a symbolic gesture towards Reconstruction and everything that it represented. So they are creating this climate of fear, this climate where, African Americans or Republicans or people that are supportive of these changes will be too afraid to support them publicly anymore. They'll be too afraid to say and to stand up and say these are the changes that need to happen. When election day comes, and that's the big one, when election day comes, they'll be too afraid to go and vote. They'll be too afraid to show up at the polling place knowing that they are going to be targeted or their family is going to be targeted. And this stuff was not discreet. It was not, under wraps or behind closed doors. This was all out in the open. And these people are committing these kinds of acts, trying to create this situation where everybody who would have supported Reconstruction will be too afraid to do so. And this ends up having the desired effect. As a result, Republicans are going to lose power. If people that support the Republican Party are too scared to show up on election day, they're not going to win the election. And the other thing that white Southerners are doing, in addition to all the violence and the threats and the Klan activity, is they're rigging the elections. There's voter fraud all over the place. And so a lot of the time, Democrats are regaining power and Republicans are losing power in the South. We're seeing that whole Reconstruction trend reversing, sometimes due to voter fraud and things like that are taking place in this time as well. Now, all this violence just runs rampant. That might beg the question, why don't they get in trouble if they're out just, killing people in broad daylight, which they were? Why aren't they getting in trouble for it? Well, local authorities, that would have been arresting people or charging people with crimes, those are some of the same people that are doing this stuff to begin with. So they're oftentimes not going to arrest people. They won't go to trial for it. If they do, they're going to get a sympathetic jury that's not going to convict them of anything. So you have this, almost kind of Wild West situation happening in the South, and nobody's being brought to justice. Nothing is being done to, stop these people from violating the rights of others, from killing, from committing these acts of violence, all kind of things like that. So eventually in the 1870s, the federal government even gets involved in it and tries to stop Klan violence with some laws called the Enforcement Acts. There's several different enforcement acts. The idea behind them. So the Enforcement Acts, this was the federal government trying to put a stop to Klan violence, basically making all the different things that the Klan was doing a federal crime, so the federal government could prosecute people, seeing as how the states weren't. Here's the weird thing about the Enforcement Acts, is that they actually kind of work. It actually does have success in that a lot of thousands of people are arrested. Some of them go to trial, a lot of them don't. No one really goes to jail for like a super long amount of time with this kind of thing, but it does have the success or the effect of at the very least, forcing the Ku Klux Klan underground, getting them to where they're not just out there in the wide open doing everything. Now, they never completely go away, and next year you'll see them have a complete resurgence by the 1920s. But the irony of it is, yes, it does stop the Ku Klux Klan, or it stops a lot of them, or at least puts a halt on most of it. But the thing is, the damage had already been done. The Klan had really already accomplished what they set out to accomplish, and that was to stop Reconstruction, to create a situation where people were too afraid to allow Reconstruction to continue. So they had already, scared enough people or killed enough people or hurt enough people to the point where they were no longer going to show their support for Reconstruction. That plus the fact that Congress by this time, by the late 1870s or mid 1870s, had passed a law called the Amnesty Act. Amnesty means like forgiveness, like you're being shielded from something. And so a lot of those same ex-Confederate leaders, white Southerners that had been shut out of power in the Reconstruction era, if you remember that Military Reconstruction Act, how it said those people couldn't vote anymore, the Amnesty Act restored voting rights and restored citizenship and restored all of those things back to those former Confederate leaders. So what had been taken away from them has now been given back to them. So many of them also don't feel the need to engage in Klan violence because they got their rights back anyway. So because of the fact that Klan violence has caused Democrats to regain control over the South, voter fraud has caused Democrats to regain control over the South, and the Amnesty Act has caused Democrats to regain control over the South, Democrats find themselves in most to be back in control by the mid to late 1870s. That varies from state to state. But once Democrats have control again, they're not going to continue with Reconstruction policies. One of the first thing on their agenda will be to say, we're done with Reconstruction. We're not enforcing Reconstruction policies anymore. At the same time that they're doing that, the American public, people outside of the South, are also growing weary of Reconstruction. And the federal government itself is beginning to be very to question Reconstruction and to rethink it, and not as supportive of it, and not as forceful with it as they once were. By the 1870s, various things have caused the American public to stop supporting Reconstruction, whereas in 1865, when the war ended, there were a lot of Americans that were just really gung-ho. We've got to make this happen. The South's got to change. We're going to see to it that African Americans gain rights. We're going to go in there and just create this new Jerusalem in the South. Their attitude about that is definitely different 10 years later. Many are very frustrated with the violence that is occurring in the South. A lot of Northerners are looking at it and going, you know what, this is impossible. We can't enforce stuff on people that are obviously this hostile to it. All we're causing is bloodshed in the streets. That's not good. So a lot of people are worried about that and see that as a bigger problem. A lot of people in the North or other parts of the country actually sympathize with the white South, because racial equality is not a popular idea anywhere. So a lot of them are saying, we don't believe in racial equality, so why should we be forcing that on the South? No wonder they're killing people in the street. So they're starting to see it that way. Also, there's just a general consensus that Reconstruction was impossible, that Reconstruction had failed, that it could never be successful. People are starting to say, hey, maybe it was a good idea, but it's never going to work, and it's not worth the money, it's not worth the time, it's not worth the violence. And people are also starting to become preoccupied with other problems. You know, the country's kind of moving on. It's been 10 years. There are just other things that people are worried about. You know how we are. We get fixed on one thing, but a little bit later we're fixed on something else. And that's just kind of the reality of that. People are just kind of moving on to other problems and more concerned with those. Some of those other problems people are more concerned about was a lot of corruption and scandal that was taking place within the Grant administration. Grant himself never involved in any of that, but there, at least as far as we know. But there were several different bribery scandals and different things like that that involved not Grant, but people in his administration. And so some people were seeing government corruption as a real problem that needed to be addressed. The economy took a bad turn, and we know that economic trouble always tends to make people forget about other things and concentrate on the economy. There was an economic depression called the Panic of 1873. A lot of banks were closing, unemployment was very high, businesses were failing, and so again, for a lot of folks, that was the problem that needed to be addressed, not the rights of African Americans in the South, not Reconstruction in the South, and those kind of things. There was also a growing debate over currency. There were some people wanted to keep those greenbacks, that paper money that had been issued during the Civil War, and some people didn't. And that's brewing into a big debate, what's called the monetary debate or the currency debate, which will continue until about the turn of the century. That's going to become one of the biggest arguments since slavery. And so all these things are just kind of occupying people's mind and making people less committed. That's the word that's covered up by my face. Less committed to Reconstruction, and people that are starting to say, you know, forget it for whatever reason, whether they didn't really believe in it that much to begin with or they've changed their mind. They're just kind of ready to move on to some other things. And so Reconstruction has proven itself by this time to have not been an effective thing in the long term, and there's just lots of other things going on that cause a lot of people to start looking another direction. Keeping in mind also, Reconstruction was never supposed to last forever. This was always, always, always supposed to be a temporary thing. The federal government was never meant to rule these southern states forever. It was always okay, do these things and then we'll leave you alone. Well, a lot of states by the 1870s have done those things, at least in the short term. And so Reconstruction had ended there. They had done what they said they were going to do, and then white Southern Democrats regain control and they start reversing it, but it didn't matter because by that point, Reconstruction was over. The federal government had removed itself from those states. They were no longer, breathing down those states' necks and making sure they were doing certain things. So by the late 1870s, by the time the federal government officially abandons Reconstruction was really already over in most places anyway. Most southern states have already been readmitted due to violence, due to the fraud. Republicans have lost power. Democrats have regained power in most of those states, and Reconstruction's over. And this had led to what Southerners called a redemption of the South. redemption, if you get redeemed, that word means like forgiveness. It means like you regained something. If you did something wrong and then you redeem yourself, it's like making up for that past mistake. So when white Southern Democrats regain control and that the Republican Reconstruction government no longer has power, white Southern Democrats would call that redemption. They would call that redemption because in their mind, it was like they were getting back what they had lost. They were getting back the power that had been taken away from them during Reconstruction. They were doing away with this horrible, corrupt, illegitimate Reconstruction government and putting in the real government, the thing that really had the authority. So they called that redemption. So they would refer to that moment when white Southern Democrats regained control, when they took back over the South, that was redemption. And by the time the federal government officially ends Reconstruction, the most of the South had already been quote unquote redeemed, and there were really just a few southern states where Reconstruction was still technically going on, meaning that the federal government was still kind of present in those states. So how does it end there? Well, that actually happens as a result of a kind of botched or confused presidential election, the election of 1876. In the election of 1876, your two candidates were Samuel Tilden, who ran as the Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, who ran as the Republican. But we ran into a problem when the election results came in, because the election results were disputed. There were some states, 3 states to be exact, in which the results were unclear, and they did not know who won those states, Tilden or Hayes. And the thing is that both of these states turned in like 2 sets of election returns. They turned in one set that would have suggested that Tilden won and one set that says Hayes won. So obviously what happened is that there were voter fraud. One of those sets is a fake, and where somebody has, tried to shift the results. And again, voter fraud was rampant throughout these states. And so they're not really sure what to do with it because they don't really know. Clearly there was something illegal went on, but they don't know what. And they're not really sure what to do. And it just so happens that the 3 states in which there were disputed results, where there was clearly some voter fraud, it happens to be these 3 southern states here, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And those happen to be the 3 southern states that had not yet been quote-unquote redeemed, those that were still in the process of redemption, where there was still a lot of voter fraud going on. So this election ends up in Congress. This ends up in the House of Representatives to decide, because they're going to decide where it's supposed to go and how it should end. And what they come up with is what we call the Compromise of 1877. So this election is going to end up in an alleged agreement that we call the Compromise of 1877. Calling it the alleged or supposed Compromise of 1877 is pretty important, because every other agreement we've talked about that sounds like that, the compromise of this or whatever, those were like official congressional agreements. They were laws basically that were voted on by Congress. This actually isn't. This is a supposed agreement. There is no official record that Congress actually officially agreed on anything. This is something that we assume. We assume when the House got together to decide this election, they made some kind of a deal, to appease everyone, to make everybody happy, and we call that the Compromise of 1877. So here's what they agree to in this supposed agreement. They agree that Hayes will be president, so they're going to shift those disputed votes to Hayes, who was the Republican. And we assume that, okay, if Hayes, the Republican, is going to be president, the South's not going to be too happy about that, so there must have been something here for them. They must have been given something in return in order to be okay with Hayes becoming president. So it is supposed, we believe, that something was the end of Reconstruction. So this is the supposed Compromise of 1877. Hayes gets to be president if he ends Reconstruction. If the federal government officially ends Reconstruction, we say it's over, it's done, time of death, we're done with it. They remove all remaining federal troops from the South and basically leave the South alone and let the South do what they want to do without the federal government breathing down their neck. So as a result of this supposed compromise, the Compromise of 1877 is important not so much because Hayes becomes the president. We consider the Compromise of 1877 to be the official end of Reconstruction, that this is the moment, which it was really all but over anyway, but this is where they officially seal the deal and say we are done with Reconstruction, it is not happening anymore, and Reconstruction is totally abandoned by the federal government. All remaining troops groups are removed from the South, and that allows Southern states to regain and to reestablish what they would call home rule, which means that they, Southerners, white Southerners that is, are now controlling everything without the federal government watching them and breathing down their neck and making sure that they're doing things. So let's talk about what the South, what that post-Reconstruction South looks like. Now that the federal government is gone, the federal government is not, as I keep saying, breathing down their neck, making sure that they're doing all these things. As you can probably guess, with white Southern Democrats now having redeemed those governments and the federal government's looking the other way, they are now going to start reversing a lot of those Reconstruction era policies, reversing a lot of the changes and the progress, unfortunately, that had been made during Reconstruction. So they will start lowering taxes, they'll start putting less money towards certain programs, but we particularly want to talk about ways that they start undermining a lot of the Reconstruction policies, particularly those that had to do with racial equality or increased rights for African Americans. I kept mentioning that those increased rights and increased racial equality that African Americans experienced during Reconstruction unfortunately turn out to be quite short-lived, because once Reconstruction's over with, they find ways around it. So they start passing in Southern states, as soon as Reconstruction is over, they start passing laws, discriminatory laws against African Americans that become known as Jim Crow laws, and we see the implementation of the Jim Crow system, or the Jim Crow South. And this is the system of legal racial segregation. So this is the beginnings of separate facilities, separate public places, separate seats in theaters and on train cars, eventually on buses, separate schools, eventually the separate water fountains, businesses that only allowed white people to enter or to patronize the business, and so forth, which, as most of you probably know, persisted as a reality in the South until the Civil Rights Movement. Those are Jim Crow laws. Now, I find that students oftentimes confuse Jim Crow and black codes. So just to clarify, black codes were laws that were passed right after the war was over, right? Really before Reconstruction even started. And that was the stuff very similar to slave codes, like can't hold a weapon, can't own property, that sort of thing. Jim Crow comes after Reconstruction, and this is the segregation, the legal segregation. Think about the separate facilities and separate restrooms and all that kind of stuff. So that becomes the reality in every southern state as a result of the end of Reconstruction. And then they start finding other ways to get around some of those other things, because they can't change like the constitutional amendments. 15th Amendment is still there. 14th Amendment is still there, that says, what it says. In the 15th Amendment, you can't take away someone's right to vote based on race. So southern states get more creative, and they say, well, if we can't take it away based on race, we'll find something else to take it away. And so this is where we see the implementation of poll taxes and literacy tests. That is part of the Jim Crow system, a way of taking away political power from African Americans. Poll taxes would have been a tax that you had to pay in order to vote, and that unfairly targets African Americans as well as poor white Southerners, because both of those groups were oftentimes in poverty, and so paying a poll tax would have been difficult to do. And so you're taking away voting rights from that lower class, lower socioeconomic class, as well as people that tended to be of certain other minorities. And also the implementation of literacy tests, which is unfortunately covered up by my face right here. Literacy tests. Literacy tests were designed and billed as a test of a person's ability to read. And so southern states would say, well, you got to be able to read to vote, so here you have to pass this test. But these tests, you all, and you can go online and look at some of them, because these were still being used in the South up until the 1960s. These tests were ridiculously impossible. They were designed to be confusing. They're truly not a test of literacy. That's not what they were really trying to do. They were trying to keep African Americans away from voting, which they did. And these tests were very subjective. It's obviously going to be a white person who's going to be grading it. Oftentimes the office where you might take the test or pay a poll tax might only be open for like an hour out of the month, and they're not even there then. And then plus the fact that you would be a target for violence or other kinds of repercussions if you even tried. So these have the effect of taking away voting rights from nearly all African Americans in the South. During Reconstruction, you saw as many as 90% of eligible African American voters exercising that right. After Reconstruction, it's probably less than 5%. And all these things persist until Reconstruction or until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, which some people even today call that a second Reconstruction, kind of a second time that the federal government intervened and said, you have to do these things, you're not doing this correctly, and you have to make these changes. So Reconstruction, whether or not it's a success or a failure, that's not an easy question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. It's rather a complicated one. Did they end up creating this environment of racial equality and all those kind of things like some radical Republicans probably envisioned? No, they certainly didn't. And it's rather sad that this was kind of a time where maybe we had that opportunity and failed to do certain things to make that happen. But it also did bring about changes that were still really important. They do lay the groundwork for things that were to come. You did get those 14th and 15th Amendments, which I don't know if those could have been passed any other way. And then the changes that come 100 years later in the Civil Rights Movement, those wouldn't have happened if you hadn't had those Reconstruction Amendments. So it's, it's not an easy question. It doesn't have a simple answer, but so those are some things you'll see again next year when you look at the Civil Rights Movement. So an interesting time, a rather tragic and ironic kind of a time, but the system of Jim Crow will unfortunately remain in the South for about the next century to come.